Get ready to have your perception of history gently realigned. We are journeying back in time, uncovering some truly remarkable legal powers held by women who were not married. If you imagined women in past eras primarily waiting for marriage, let us explore a different reality. Consider unmarried women in ancient Egypt, more than 3 millennia ago, independently owning businesses and land. Or picture single women in medieval England, recognized by the law as femme souls, capably signing their own contracts and presenting their own cases in court. This is just the beginning. We will learn about influential priestesses in ancient Mesopotamia, who managed significant estates, Viking women who could inherit property and hold considerable sway, and determined she merchants in early America forging their own paths to success. These are not imagined tales. These are documented rights, real women, and recorded history. Let's count down 5 of the most surprising legal rights that afforded unmarried women a significant degree of agency, often much earlier than commonly thought. Number 5. Colonial Americas. She merchants. Unmarried women carving out fortunes. Long before the United States was even a dream, on the rugged shores of colonial North America, a surprising number of unmarried women were making their mark in the world of commerce. These women, whether they had never married or were widows, found ways to navigate a complex legal and social landscape to become business owners, traders, and artisans. They were sometimes called she merchants, a term that acknowledged their active role in the economy. The legal situation for women in the American colonies was heavily influenced by English common law. This system included the concept of coverture, which meant that when a woman married, her legal identity was essentially absorbed by her husband's. A married woman, or femme covert, generally could not own property in her own name, make contracts, or sue or be sued independently. Her husband controlled her property, her earnings, and her legal actions. However, this very restriction on married women inadvertently created a different status for unmarried adult women. Single women who had never married, known as spinsters, or femme sole and widows, were not covered by a husband's legal identity. As a result, they could legally own property, run businesses, enter into contracts, and manage their own financial affairs. They could also appear in court to represent their own interests. This legal status of femme sole provided a pathway for enterprise. In bustling port cities like Boston, Philadelphia, New York, and Charleston, and even in smaller towns and rural areas, unmarried women engaged in a wide variety of economic activities. Many took over businesses left by their deceased husbands or fathers. For instance, a widow might continue her husband's tavern, print shop, or import-export business. Records from the 17th and 18th centuries show women operating as innkeepers, shopkeepers selling everything from dry goods to groceries, milliners, dressmakers, silversmiths, and even blacksmiths. Mary Catherine Goddard, for example, was a prominent printer and postmistress in Baltimore during the American Revolution. She never married and managed a significant printing business, even printing an early copy of the Declaration of Independence that included the signers' names in January 1777. The opportunities varied by region and by the specific economic needs of the colonies. In New Netherland, which later became New York, Dutch law initially provided women, both married and unmarried, with more economic autonomy than English common law. Margaret Hardenbroek Phillips arrived in New Amsterdam in the mid-17th century as an agent for her merchant cousin in Holland. She quickly established herself as a formidable trader, dealing in furs and other goods, and owned ships. Even after her first husband died and she remarried, she continued to manage her extensive business interests, often in partnership with her second husband, Frederick Phillips, but with clear evidence of her independent acumen and capital. She was an exceptionally successful example, but her story points to the possibilities available. Widows in particular often found themselves in a position to exercise significant economic power. While losing a husband was a personal tragedy, it also legally transformed a woman from a femme covert back to a femme sole, or rather, continued her status as an independent legal agent if she had been widowed. If her husband left her property or control of his business, she was free to manage it as she saw fit. Many wills from this period show husbands entrusting their businesses and estates to their wives, sometimes until their sons came of age, but often for the widow's lifetime. These women then had to learn trades, manage finances, and deal with suppliers and customers. For instance, Elizabeth Timothy became the first female newspaper publisher and editor in the American colonies in 1738 after her husband, Lewis Timothy, died. She took over the South Carolina Gazette in Charleston with Benjamin Franklin as a business partner and ran it successfully for several years before her son Peter took over. Types of businesses unmarried women ran were diverse. Retail was common. Women owned and operated small shops, often out of their homes, selling imported goods like textiles, tea, sugar, and ceramics, or locally produced items. Tavern keeping was another frequent occupation for widows. Taverns were central to colonial life, serving as inns, meeting places, and social hubs, and running one required considerable skill in management and hospitality. Women were also heavily involved in producing and selling goods like butter, cheese, candles, soap, and textiles. Eliza Lucas Pinckney, though she later married, made a huge impact as a young unmarried woman in South Carolina in the 1740s. Left in charge of her father's 3 plantations when she was only 16 years old, she experimented with crops and is credited with successfully developing indigo as a major cash crop for the colony. Her letters reveal a sharp mind for agriculture and business management. While the legal status of femme sole allowed for these activities, it was not always an easy path. Unmarried women in business still faced social scrutiny. Access to credit could be more difficult for them than for men. Their sphere of operation was often, though not always, considered to be an extension of domestic skills, such as millinery or innkeeping. However, the sheer number of advertisements placed by women in colonial newspapers for their goods and services, and the records of their property transactions and court appearances show that they were a vital part of the colonial economy. For example, an analysis of newspaper advertisements in cities like Philadelphia and Boston shows hundreds of women advertising businesses ranging from boarding houses to artisanal crafts. Between the early 1700s, the American Revolution itself brought both challenges and new opportunities for some unmarried businesswomen. War disrupted trade, but it also created demand for certain goods and services that women could provide. Some women acted as sutlers, following armies and selling provisions. After the war, as the new nation began to form, the legal framework largely continued the English common law traditions, including coverture. Yet the precedent of economically active unmarried women had been firmly set during the colonial period. These she merchants and artisans, through their enterprise as spinsters and widows, demonstrated that women could be successful economic actors, managing property and navigating the commercial world with skill and determination, using the legal space available to them as individuals. Their stories are found in account books, court records, wills, and the fading print of colonial newspapers, painting a picture of surprising economic independence for some women in a world often perceived as highly restrictive. Number 4. Mesopotamian priestesses. More than prayer, they wielded economic power. In the ancient lands of Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization nestled between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, a unique group of unmarried women held significant economic and legal power thousands of years ago. These were not queens or noble women in the typical sense, but priestesses dedicated to various deities. Among the most well-documented are the Naditu women of Sitpur, a city devoted to the sun god Shamash during the Old Babylonian period, roughly from 2000 to 1600 before Common Era. Term naditu itself can be translated as fallow or set aside, indicating women who were dedicated to a god and typically did not marry or bear children, though the specifics varied. What is truly surprising about these naditu women, particularly those associated with the god Shamash in Sitpur, is the extent of their involvement in the city's economy. Archaeological discoveries, especially vast archives of cuneiform tablets, which are clay tablets inscribed with wedge-shaped writing, have revealed that these priestesses were major landowners, savvy investors, and active participants in commerce. These tablets, essentially the legal and financial records of the time, detail their transactions, buying and selling houses and fields, renting out properties, lending silver or grain at interest, and even engaging in long-distance trade ventures. They acted as independent legal agents, signing contracts in their own names and appearing in court to defend their interests. Many naditu women came from wealthy and influential families, including royal families. For instance, daughters of kings were sometimes dedicated as naditu priestesses. This connection to elite families often meant they entered their sacred roles with significant dowries or inheritances. However, unlike married women whose property might be managed or controlled by their husbands, the naditu women managed their wealth themselves. They lived in a special section of the city, often described as a cloister or a walled-off precinct near the temple. But this seclusion did not mean isolation from economic life. Instead, it seems to have provided a protected space from which they could conduct their affairs. The cuneiform records provide a wealth of specific examples. We find tablets recording a naditu woman named Amet Shamash purchasing a field from another individual with the names of witnesses and the price clearly stated. Another tablet might show a naditu like Lamasi lending a quantity of silver to a merchant with the terms of repayment and the interest rate specified. Interest rates could be substantial, often around 20% for silver and 33% for barley. These priestesses also owned and managed date palm orchards, which were a vital agricultural resource, and records show them leasing these orchards to cultivators and collecting a share of the harvest. Some naditu women even owned and managed a staff of male and female slaves who worked their lands or assisted in their households and businesses. One notable naditu was Iltani, a daughter of King Sin Mubalit and sister of the famous King Hammurabi, who reigned from 1792 to 1750 before Common Era. Surviving letters and administrative texts reveal Iltani's extensive business activities. She managed large estates, oversaw agricultural production, and was involved in textile manufacturing within her household. She corresponded with officials regarding her affairs, demonstrating a clear command of her resources and a network of agents working for her. Her high social standing undoubtedly contributed to her influence, but her activities were typical of the economic engagement of many naditu. The legal framework that allowed for this is partly understood through law codes like the Code of Hammurabi. While this code, like others from Mesopotamia, generally placed women under the authority of fathers or husbands, it also contained specific provisions related to different classes of women, including certain priestesses. For example, these laws might stipulate how a naditu's property was to be managed or inherited. Crucially, because they did not typically marry and have children who would inherit in the usual way, there were often specific rules about how their property would pass, sometimes to their brothers or adopted heirs, or back to the templar or their original family depending on the circumstances and the type of naditu. The key insight is that the property was theirs to manage during their lifetime. Their ability to engage in these activities was also tied to their literacy or access to scribes. Complex contractual arrangements required for buying, selling, leasing, and lending all depended on written documents, Many naditu women may have been literate themselves, or they employed scribes to manage their extensive records. The sheer volume of tablets found in the areas they inhabited in Sipper points to a highly bureaucratized and legally sophisticated economic life. Hundreds of such tablets detail the business dealings of these women over several centuries. It is important to note that not all priestesses in Mesopotamia had this level of economic independence, and not all naditu lived in the same way. There were different ranks and types of naditu associated with different gods and temples. However, the naditu of Shamash in Sipper represent a particularly striking example of unmarried women exercising a surprising degree of financial autonomy and legal personhood. They could accumulate wealth, pass it on through carefully constructed legal agreements, and use the court system to enforce their contracts. Their lives were dedicated to religious service, but this service did not preclude them from being powerful economic players. They invested in land, in commercial ventures, and in people through loans, contributing significantly to the economic fabric of their city. These ancient clay tablets, once buried for millennia, now tell a story of unmarried women who were far from marginalized, instead acting as astute businesswomen with considerable control over their own property and financial destinies in a world over 3,500 years ago. Number 3. Medieval England's femme sole. Single ladies, serious business. In medieval England, a society often pictured as rigidly patriarchal, there existed a fascinating legal status for unmarried women that allowed them a surprising degree of economic and legal independence. This status was known as femme sole, a law French term meaning woman alone. It applied to adult women who were not currently married, which included women who had never married, often called spinsters, and widows. As a femme sole, a woman could own property, make contracts, run a business, and, crucially, sue and be sued in the royal courts in her own name. This stood in stark contrast to the legal position of a married woman, or femme covert, whose legal identity was largely subsumed by that of her husband under the doctrine of coverture. The development of the femme sole status was part of English common law, which evolved over centuries through judicial decisions and custom, rather than through a single comprehensive written code. From around the 12th century onwards, the legal framework increasingly distinguished between the rights of married and unmarried women, while a married woman's property generally came under her husband's control, though with some protections for her dower rights, which was property intended to support her if she became a widow. A femme sole had much more direct control over her own assets and earnings. This legal capacity opened doors for unmarried women to participate actively in the economic life of medieval towns and villages. Many unmarried women and widows engaged in various trades and crafts. They were brewers, bakers, spinners, weavers, tailors, embroiderers, and shopkeepers. Ale brewing, for instance, was a very common occupation for women, often run from their own homes. These alewives or brewsters were a familiar sight in medieval communities. Records from manorial courts, which handled local legal matters, and borough courts in towns, frequently mention women involved in such enterprises. For example, court rolls might list women fined for breaking the assize of ale, regulations concerning the quality or price of ale, which, while a penalty, also confirms their active participation in the trade as independent producers. In larger towns and cities like London, York, or Norwich, opportunities for femme soles could be even more diverse. Guild records, which were associations of craftsmen and merchants, sometimes show women as members, particularly widows carrying on their late husband's trades. While it was often more difficult for a woman to become a full guild master in her own right, if she had not inherited the position. There are instances of women achieving this or operating substantial businesses. For example, records from the late 14th and 15th centuries in London show women registered as femme sole traders with the city authorities. This special registration in some boroughs like London allowed a married woman to trade as if she were single, regarding her business dealings with her husband not being liable for her business debts, but the core concept of femme sole primarily applied to those truly unmarried. For spinsters and widows, no such special registration was needed to trade under their femme sole status. It was their default legal position. The ability to make contracts was fundamental. A femme sole could buy and sell goods, lease property, and borrow or lend money. Her signature or mark on a contract was legally binding. This meant she could acquire the raw materials for her craft, sell her finished products, and manage her own finances. Wills and property deeds from the medieval period provide evidence of unmarried women owning houses, land, and various personal possessions. For example, surviving wills written by widows and spinsters detail their careful disposition of property, naming heirs and making bequests, demonstrating their recognized right to own and transfer property. Some unmarried women accumulated considerable wealth. Halis Hassan, a London businesswoman in the early 15th century, was a widow who became a successful moneylender and property owner, engaging in complex financial transactions. Furthermore, the right to sue and be sued meant that a femme sole could defend her property and contractual rights in court. If someone owed her money, she could take them to court. If she was accused of not fulfilling a contract, she would answer for herself. Court records show numerous cases involving unmarried women as plaintiffs or defendants. This legal agency was a significant aspect of their independence. They were not reliant on a male relative to represent them in legal matters concerning their own business or property. For instance, plea rolls from the royal courts contain entries where a woman identified as a femme sole brings a suit for debt or trespass. Of course, the life of a femme sole was not without its challenges. Social expectations still often favored marriage as the primary role for women. Economic opportunities could be limited by custom and by restricted access to formal apprenticeships in some of the more lucrative trades, which were often dominated by men. However, the legal framework of femme sole provided a recognized space for unmarried women to operate with a degree of autonomy that is often underestimated. The number of women who actively used this status is difficult to quantify precisely for the entire medieval period, but local studies of specific towns or regions reveal a consistent presence of economically active single women and widows. For example, studies of tax records, such as poll tax returns from the late 14th century, list many women, particularly widows, as heads of households and as individuals engaged in specific occupations. The status of femme sole continued from the medieval period into the early modern era, and as we saw with colonial America, its principles were carried over to the New World. It represented a long-standing feature of English common law that acknowledged that an adult woman, not under the legal coverture of a husband, had the capacity to act as an independent economic and legal agent. While medieval society was certainly hierarchical and placed many constraints on women, the femme sole stands out as a surprising and important legal right that allowed unmarried women to manage their own affairs, contribute to the economy, and have a recognized legal presence in their communities. Number 2. Viking Age Amazons. Unmarried women, land and law in the north. The Viking Age, spanning roughly from the late 8th to the mid-11th century, often conjures images of fierce male warriors and long-ship raids. However, when we look beyond these popular portrayals and delve into the legal and social structures of Norse society, particularly in Scandinavia and the Norse settlements like Iceland, a more nuanced picture of women's roles emerges. Unmarried women, including those who never married and widows, possessed some surprising legal rights concerning property, inheritance, and even personal agency, which set them apart from women in many other contemporary European societies. While the idea of shield maidens fighting alongside men is more the stuff of sagas and possibly rare exceptions rather than a common reality. The legal standing of Norse women, especially in matters of property, was quite robust. Norse law codes, such as the Gragas, Grey Goose laws, from the Icelandic Commonwealth, which were written down in the 12th and 13th centuries but reflect older customs, provide significant insights. These laws indicate that women could inherit property. Generally, sons inherited more than daughters. But if there were no sons, a daughter could inherit her father's property and position as head of the household. An unmarried woman without brothers, known as an odalkvina in some contexts, could become the owner of the family farm, a significant source of wealth and status. Even if there were sons, daughters were entitled to a share of the inheritance, though it was typically smaller, often half of what a son received. This inherited property was hers to control, especially if she remained unmarried. Runestones, which are memorial stones often erected by families, sometimes mention women as inheritors or commissioners of the stones, indicating their recognized status and connection to ancestral land. For example, the Dinna stone from Norway, dating to the mid-11th century, was raised by a mother in memory of her daughter Astrid, and details Astrid's good qualities, implying her importance within the family and community. Widows, in particular, held a strong legal position. A widow was entitled to her dowry, the property she brought into the marriage, heimenfylgja, and often also a mourning gift, mundra or tilgift, from her husband. Upon her husband's death, she regained full control of these assets. Furthermore, she often had rights to a portion of her husband's estate for her lifetime, or she might manage the entire estate if her children were minors. As a femme sole, in essence, she could manage this property, engage in transactions, and maintain the household. Archaeological evidence from Viking graves sometimes shows women buried with keys, symbolizing their role as managers of the household and its property. The husfreyja, or lady of the house, was a respected position, and an unmarried daughter or a widow could hold this authority. Beyond property, unmarried women had a degree of personal agency. While marriages were often arranged by families, Norse women seem to have had some say in the matter, and there are accounts in the sagas which, while literary, may reflect social norms of women refusing proposed matches. More strikingly, both women and men could initiate divorce. The grounds for divorce could be varied, including physical abuse, desertion, or even if a husband satirized his wife in verse or failed to provide for the family. If a woman initiated the divorce, she was generally entitled to reclaim her dowry and any property she had brought into the marriage. This right to divorce and to retain her property afterward gave an unmarried or subsequently divorced woman significant leverage and independence compared to women in many other parts of Europe at the time where divorce was virtually impossible or highly restricted. The sagas, such as the Laxdæla saga or Njáls saga, feature powerful female characters, some of whom are unmarried or widowed, who are assertive, manage large estates, and influence political events. While these are literary works and should be interpreted with caution, they likely drew upon recognizable social realities and legal possibilities for women. Characters like Odd the Deep minded a widow who led an expedition to Iceland and claimed vast tracts of land, distributing it to her followers, exemplify the potential for female leadership and property control, particularly for women of high status. Odd, as described in the Landnámabók, the Book of Settlements, was a Christian widow who, after the death of her son, organized a ship, captained it, and settled in Iceland, becoming a significant matriarch. Archaeological finds also support the idea of women holding respected positions. Richly furnished female graves, containing jewelry, tools related to textile production, a valuable economic activity, and sometimes even weapons, though the interpretation of female warrior graves is still debated by scholars, suggest that some women achieved considerable status and wealth, not necessarily tied to a husband. The Oseberg ship burial in Norway, dating to around 834 Common Era, contained the remains of two women, one older and one younger, buried with extraordinary wealth and artifacts indicating very high status. While their exact roles are unknown, perhaps a queen and her attendant or revered priestesses, the richness of the burial speaks volumes about the potential standing of women. It's important not to romanticize the situation. Viking society was still male-dominated in many respects. Men held primary roles in warfare, politics like the Althing, the Icelandic Assembly, and long-distance trade. However, within the sphere of the household, local community, and property management, unmarried women and widows could wield considerable influence and legal authority. Their rights to inherit and own property, to manage estates as heads of household if circumstances allowed, and to initiate divorce and reclaim their assets were quite advanced for the period. These legal provisions provided a framework within which unmarried Norse women could achieve a degree of economic independence and personal autonomy that was surprisingly substantial, making them more than just background figures in the sagas of Viking men. Their stories are pieced together from terse law codes, evocative runic inscriptions, archaeological treasures, and the powerful narratives of the sagas, revealing a world where unmarried women could indeed be keyholders to significant power. Number 1. Ancient Egypt's trailblazers. Unmarried women with astonishing autonomy. Prepare to be astonished as we travel back thousands of years to ancient Egypt, a civilization renowned for its pyramids, pharaohs, and hieroglyphs. What is often less known is the remarkable legal status of women, particularly the rights afforded to them irrespective of their marital status. Legal documents and other records consistently show that women in ancient Egypt, whether married or unmarried, could own, inherit, and dispose of property, enter into contracts, initiate lawsuits, and act as witnesses in court. For unmarried women, this meant they could exercise these rights with full personal autonomy. In ancient Egyptian law, a woman's legal identity was independent of men. She did not need a male guardian to act on her behalf in legal or economic matters. This is a striking contrast to many other ancient societies, such as ancient Greece or Rome, in certain periods where women often required a male relative, father, husband, or son, to represent them in legal transactions. In Egypt, an unmarried adult woman could buy, sell, or lease land, own houses, goods, and slaves, and bequeath her property to whomever she chose through a written will. She could also borrow and lend money or goods. The evidence for these rights comes from a wealth of preserved papyri, legal documents such as marriage settlements, which themselves often detailed the wife's property, deeds of sale, loan agreements, wills, and court records. These documents frequently name women as contracting parties. For instance, a papyrus might record a woman named Ta-Sheret purchasing a plot of land from a man named Amenhotep, with the dimensions of the land, the price paid, often in goods like grain, oil, or silver, and the names of witnesses all carefully noted. The fact that an unmarried woman could be a primary party in such a transaction using her own resources and in her own name is profoundly significant. One of the most famous examples illustrating women's property rights comes from the Will of Nonakate, dating to the New Kingdom, around 1145, before Common Era. Nanakate was a woman who had been married twice and had several children. In her will discovered at Deir el-Medina, the village of the workmen who built the royal tombs, she carefully listed her property and designated which of her children would inherit from her, and significantly, which would be disinherited due to their perceived lack of care for her in her old age. This document clearly shows her full control over her own property, which she had acquired or inherited, and her right to dispose of it as she saw fit, even counter to some customary expectations of equal inheritance among children. While Nona Kate was married during parts of her life, her ability to make such a will demonstrates the underlying principle of female property ownership that would fully apply to an unmarried woman managing her own assets. Unmarried women could also engage in business. While large-scale commerce was often, but not exclusively, in the hands of men or state institutions, women were active in local markets, in textile production. Weaving and spinning were major female occupations. Brewing, baking, and providing services such as domestic work or entertainment, music and dance. An unmarried woman who earned income from these activities controlled her earnings. There are depictions in tomb paintings and texts that show women engaged in these economic activities. For example, market scenes sometimes depict women selling produce or crafts. Furthermore, women could pursue legal action. If an unmarried woman had a grievance, for example, if someone had failed to repay a loan or had encroached on her property, she could bring a case before the local court, kendet. Court records show women acting as plaintiffs, defendants, and witnesses. They would present their own cases, or they could appoint a representative, just as men could. There was no legal barrier to a woman speaking for herself in a court of law. These courts dealt with a wide range of civil matters, and the surviving records indicate that women actively used the legal system to protect their rights and interests. For instance, a dispute over inheritance or property boundaries could well involve an unmarried woman arguing her claim. The basis for these rights appears to be deeply embedded in Egyptian social and legal custom from very early periods. Egyptian society did not have the same concept of coverture found in later English common law. While marriage was a social institution, it did not fundamentally alter a woman's legal capacity or her right to own property separately from her husband. Therefore, an unmarried woman simply continued to exercise the rights she inherently possessed as an individual. Even in terms of personal status, while marriage was common, there was no legal or social imperative that severely disadvantaged an unmarried woman in terms of her basic legal personhood. Women could also initiate divorce. If a marriage ended, the woman was entitled to reclaim any property she had brought into the marriage, and often a share of the couple's joint property acquired during the marriage as stipulated in their marriage settlement. This meant a woman was not necessarily trapped in an unhappy marriage for economic reasons and could return to an unmarried status with her property intact. The level of autonomy granted to unmarried women in ancient Egypt, particularly concerning property and legal standing, was truly exceptional for its time and for many centuries that followed in other parts of the world. Their ability to independently manage wealth, conduct business, and seek justice through the courts is documented through thousands of years of Egyptian history. This was not a temporary phase or a right limited to a specific elite class, though wealthier women naturally had more property to manage. The legal principles applied broadly. The surviving papyri, from official state decrees to private letters and humble legal agreements, paint a consistent picture of a society where an unmarried woman was a full legal person capable of navigating the economic and legal worlds with a surprising degree of freedom and authority. These ancient trailblazers set a standard for female legal rights that would not be seen again in many cultures for millennia.